The real thing we wanted to start out with today is this whole, just a whole supply chain discussion. And you have some interesting findings and just some recent trends in the news that tie back to this whole concept of supply chain management and how important it is to manage your supply chain and how difficult it can be to manage global complex supply chains. So what do you
Right.
see at Paresa?
Well, it's interesting because, obviously 2020 and specifically COVID squeezed a lot of different industries. It started with the toilet paper and the paper
Right.
towels. They saw a lot of supply chain issues. It got into even the food. It got into, I remember trying to buy a bike in April and it was impossible to find a hybrid medium-sized women's bike. So, it's hit many different industries. And now we fast forward to 2021 and you're seeing it hit the automobile industry really hard, to the point where on a global scale all of these auto manufacturers are either having to slow down production, even some are completely shutting down their production plants for a given amount of time, and it all is because of these chips, these silicon chips. So you have, for example, GM, Ford, Honda, Volkswagen, all of these cars utilize these silicon chips in various aspects of their production. So, in your power steering and the radio system and, all the different aspects, so when there's a shortage, there's not much that they can do because the source of the problem, or the source of, or the starting point, I should say, of their whole production plant is on hold. So, you look at how that's related to the pandemic, and it's because everybody bought up all these laptops, game consoles like Xbox, PlayStation, etc., during the pandemic to keep themselves occupied while they're quarantined. And now it's trickled into all these different car manufacturers putting their production on hold. So, you look at, for example, in Detroit, you have GM that shut down their power plant, or their auto manufacturing plant. You have Ford who closed their plant in Germany for about a month, and Honda in UK, they have their main plant in the UK in Swindon, and they closed for several days. So it's impacting the worldwide automobile industry, and it all comes back to people playing Call of Duty.
Right.
And it's funny to see how these things are connected, but these chips, I mean, our world pretty much runs off these chips. They're utilized everywhere, and in such a tech obsessed world that we're living in, if there's a shortage there, then it's bound to hit some of these big industries.
Yeah, it's a good point. And you talk about chips or cars; those are pretty complex products. They require a lot of different raw materials and inputs from all over the world, and most countries aren't making all those products, or all those raw materials or inputs they need within their home countries, or most companies aren't making those raw materials in their home countries, I should say. So that makes it a lot more complex, especially when there's restrictions on travel and the flow of goods in general. Plus, then you add spikes in demand and that sort of thing, and that can really disrupt the supply chain as you've described there.
Right. And it sounds like there's really only two companies that are producing these 5 nanometer chips at a commercial level. It's Samsung and TMNC. So it's far and few between, right? So a lot of pressure is placed on these two companies to ramp up production. And it sounds like they are. It's not like they stopped producing, but it takes, I think they said it's a 26-week lead time to produce a chip. So, and when you look at how they're prioritizing who's getting the chips first, I mean, they're looking at what's their ROI and which, what products provide the biggest incentive to them. They're making the most money selling these chips to, the servers and kind of the tech side rather than the automobile industry, because auto manufacturers really are kind of cost conscious. It's a very cost conscious industry, so they're not necessarily making the biggest margins
Yeah.
selling to them. You know, you're not seeing like Mercedes on this list or Bentleys, for example, you're seeing the Ford, the GM. So it's interesting to see how price point also kind of puts you in line, depending on when you'll get the chips.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. And the manufacturers with less margin of error, obviously it's more difficult for them because every rushed order, expedited order they have to pay extra for, that cuts into their margin, or every delay in the production is going to cut into their margin as well. So that's a good point. You're not seeing it with those big guys that could potentially afford, such a delay or paying for expedited shipping or whatever the case may be.
Right. Absolutely. So I'm curious, how does Samsung or TMNC kind of get past this? This is a lot of pressure that's being placed on them since they're the only two that are producing on a mass scale. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean it's a tough challenge, and it's a definite curveball that the industry in general, and when I say the industry, I mean the world in general, the economy in general, every manufacturer and distribution company out there has probably felt some of the pain, as well as consumers, as like you mentioned, with the toilet paper and the sanitizer and paper towel and all the essentials that we couldn't get our hands on early in the pandemic, and in some cases, you still have issues there. But I think the key here is it all ties back to a lot of what we've been talking about on this show, and what we do as a company at Third Stage, which is focus on how do you optimize those supply chains? How can you use technology and business process improvements to potentially improve those issues that you're talking about? And a lot of companies, I think what's happened, and I can't speak for Samsung, but I can speak for other companies we've worked with. A lot of companies already had some sort of vulnerabilities in their supply chain that just they were getting by until the pandemic hit, and that really exposed a lot of these inefficiencies and ineffective processes and poor data, poor technologies, all the stuff that we help clients with. A lot of that was exposed during the pandemic. So if anything, it's a good opportunity for companies like Samsung and others to really revisit and look at their supply chain and look at everything from start to finish in terms of, do we have the right suppliers? Do we have a diversified enough supplier base? Do we have clear analytics and understanding of how our goods are flowing across borders and between different vendors and suppliers and that sort of thing? When you look at car manufacturers, for example, you use that as an example. That's really complex because you've got not just raw materials, but then you've got contractors that are also producing subassemblies, like, say, a transmission or some of the electronics that go into the car. So you've got not just the raw materials, but then you've got all these hundreds or thousands of subassemblies, and then those subassemblies go into the final car. So the supply chain, you can see how something like that could get pretty complex. And I don't understand chips as well as cars, but I suspect that building chips is fairly complex in a similar kind of way. So I think that's probably the biggest thing that companies like Samsung could do, is really look at their end-to-end supply chain and look at those bottlenecks, look at those inefficiencies, look where the breakdowns are, the pain points, all that stuff, and really look for ways to improve that either through process improvements or new technology.
Absolutely. And it's interesting too, because as these cars start advancing more and more, like for example, you have Ford that's coming out with the Mach, which is the electric SUV version of the Mustang, which I'm excited about.
I
Or
didn't
you
know about that.
have, yeah, it's so cool. You should look it up. Or they have the Bronco, all these pushes toward electric vehicles and just continuously every year improving the technology in these cars. I mean, the demand for these chips is probably only going to go up, is what I would imagine.
Yeah,
So, I hope these guys have a strong ERP system in place so that they can meet that demand.
right. Well, if they don't, they know who to call. They can call you and I, and we'll help them figure out how to improve that.
That's right.
Yeah, we've run into some of our clients, outside the world of chips and cars and some of the industries you're talking about. We've had a lot of clients, different clients, that have been affected by similar issues. And one of them is we have one that makes educational products for kids. And they have hundreds of different SKUs, different end products that they sell. And a lot of them are, scientific kits and things that are meant to be more educational. And a lot of these are produced overseas, a lot of them in China. And I know when the pandemic first hit, they got hit with a double whammy. They got hit with the fact that they were having trouble getting their warehouses replenished because of the pandemic, because of where they were sourcing a lot of the product. But then on the flip side, demand just went through the roof because kids were at home. A lot of them were, getting homeschooled, and parents were looking for things for the kids to do. And so there's a huge run on their products. So they got hit on both sides, supply and demand. So that's just one example of many clients we saw during the pandemic that are still, trying to figure out how do we navigate that. And that was right in the midst of us helping them through their transformation. So it's kind of really exposing a lot of what we were trying to help solve for them.
Right. And then fast forward, have they seen some, has it alleviated the pain point, or, are they on track to
Yeah,
get
I
there?
think it's been alleviated somewhat. I'm not sure that their supply chain is back to functioning the way it was before, and they're still in the midst of this transformation. So that that the help's on the way, but it's not, they're not through the transformation yet to kind of fix some of these issues. But they're a very high volume distribution company. I mean, they don't manufacture. They do. I think they do some light assembly, but they don't do any call it real manufacturing. They're just cranking products out the door, from their warehouses. And so, any margin, they don't have much of a margin of error there. They can't slow down, they feel it a lot more when they slow down compared to some other companies that might be lower volumes or whatever the case may be.
Wow. Yeah, it's so interesting. Just this whole pandemic has obviously been a challenge across the board, but it's interesting to see how it's really molding companies across so many different industries, whether it be in their supply chain and their processes and their general operations. It's quite fascinating what we're living through.
It is. I mean, even just on a personal level, I have a good friend who's he runs the sales and distribution arm for one of the major shoe companies, the athletic shoe companies here in North America, and he was saying that he's having trouble getting product to customers, and customers are getting really frustrated because he's selling to retailers who then sell to the end consumers, and so these are fairly big orders, big retailers trying to get the product, and he can't get the product to them because of issues with the supply chain. Now, on their side, their issue is actually kind of interesting, a little bit different dimension within the supply chain. They're having issues with the ports. So the ports throughout the world, a lot of them are either shutting down at times or experiencing delays because so many people with COVID or staffing the ports themselves are difficult. So anyone shipping product in and out of their countries as part of their business is likely or is at risk of realizing those sorts of problems where, okay, maybe the manufacturer is able to make the product, they're able to get all the raw materials they need, but they can't get the product to the warehouses in whatever country they're trying to get it to because those ports are having issues. So you really have to look at the whole thing. I mean, there's so many areas or so many points in the supply chain that can break down, and you really see how disruptions like that can affect that.
That's exactly right. There's so many points within the chain, or links within the chain, I guess you should say, that make the whole thing run smoothly. So, I mean, it makes sense. These ports as a huge transit area. I mean, for every type of good or product that comes, just looking at trade in general, that's probably why, it's hard for me to find a bike. Our bikes are mainly probably produced elsewhere, not in North America. So, you feel it across all these different industries.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's where, technology can help too. You're asking, what could Samsung and other companies do? And, one thing that we've captured or published in our 2021 digital transformation report, and we certainly use a lot more detailed metrics and data on top of that report to help our clients, evaluate technologies. But you have two different types, really, I guess, three different types of technologies that can help clients manage some of those challenges. You have kind of your core ERP systems, enterprise resource planning, which is going to be like your SAP and Oracle and Microsoft, or technologies that can tie together entire companies from financials all the way through their supply chains to their customer service, et cetera. But then you also have a second type of technology, which is supply chain management. So these are technologies that specialize in everything from the procurement of raw materials to managing transportation and logistics to warehouse management and all that good stuff. And there's a lot of ERP systems that can do that, but there's also some focused technologies that specialize in supply chain management. So this is where you run into solutions like Ariba from SAP. You have HighJump, which is a common supply chain management system. Blue Yonder or JDA. It's same company now. Product used to be called JDA, now it's called Blue Yonder. That's a common sort of best of breed focused supply chain solution that really tries to go really deep into supply chains to help address those issues. And then you've got, Oracle, Infor, Manhattan Associates is another one. And again, you can find actually our rankings and reviews of supply chain systems among other types of technologies in our 2021 digital transformation report. And I've actually included a link to that in the description for this podcast. And then the third type of technology is a warehouse management systems. So there's a lot of overlap in these three different technologies I'm talking about, but it's a matter of where the focus is. So for example, that distribution company client that we're working with that I described that had the high volumes and was running into trouble, they're more of a warehouse focused company where, the warehouse management is really important to them in terms of getting product in the door as fast as they can and getting it back out the door to customers as fast as they can. And this is where you have a lot of different focus solutions like 3PL Central is one option. You have Manhattan Associates, which also does supply chain management, Fishbowl, High Jump, Oracle, SAP, Infor. These are all different products or vendors that can provide technologies that can help address just the warehouse management side of it. So, there are technologies out there that can help, especially when you look at things like predictive analytics and the different modeling you can do with data from your supply chain. So you can start to anticipate, where could those bottlenecks be, or, where am I overly dependent on one vendor or supplier? What happens if that vendor or supplier can't get me the product that I need at the price I want, when I want it? Then who's the backup? And so it really just helps you manage all the procurement and, everything that starts with that procurement process all the way through getting the raw materials to your manufacturing, to getting it to a warehouse, to getting it to a customer, to getting it through ports, cross country, all that stuff. So those are a few ways, a few different examples of how technologies can help some of these situations you're describing.
Right. And I imagine the transparencies that these different technologies provide shine a light on opportunities to even cut costs on your raw materials or, find ways to improve efficiency. So there's a lot of benefits to implementing the right system for your processes.
Yeah, it's a good point. And you look at, cutting costs, for example, one way technology and improved processes can help you do that is, you can look at a lot of times you get these big global companies that are buying the same thing from multiple suppliers and they're not leveraging their buying power. So in other words, consolidating the purchases to one vendor, getting a better price on that. Of course, you have to weigh that cost benefit against the fact that now you're dependent on this one vendor or supplier, and if they can't pull through, then what's your backup? So it's a matter of kind of balancing that cost effectiveness that you're talking about with the flexibility of my supply chain and being able to respond quickly to customers. And I think a lot of times companies will overcorrect. They'll focus too much on cutting costs, or they'll focus too much on a flexible supply chain at the expense of higher cost. So it's all a big balancing act. You're just trying to figure out what your priorities are as an organization and as a supply chain.
Right. Awesome. I love it. And I know our first interview, I'm excited to hear his story because he's going through a transformation with Third Stage, and it sounds like it's gone very well. So I'm excited to take some key learnings from him too.
I am too. Yeah, he's a good guy. He's got some great stories to tell, and another complex product, which is beverage manufacturing. People don't realize it, but manufacturing beverages is extremely complex. Maybe not as much as a car or a chip, but still a lot of different raw materials that you have to manage. You have to manage the recipe of how to put it all together. In this case, a lot of what they produce is wine. Wine is a big part of what they sell, as well as other types of alcohol and spirits. But those are all complex products, so we'll have a good discussion with him. In fact, let's go ahead and take a break, and we'll get our discussion going, our little case study that we'll talk about, lessons from a transformation of a beverage manufacturer. We're going to cover that when we come back from Transformation Ground Control. We'll be right back.